All Dungeon Masters should play Baldur's Gate 3. That's it. That's the video. Hashtag not sponsored. It's not even an endorsement, it's just like a generally good idea. If you are a Dungeon Master, or plan on being a Dungeon Master, or have been a Dungeon Master before, you should play Baldur's Gate 3. There's no other joke here, it's just a fact. But, alright, I understand that the internet likes lists. So, here we go. Here are 5 reasons why you should play Baldur's Gate 3, and number 5 will destroy your reality. Prepare to wander the world as a shattered husk of the human being you once were, forever journeying throughout the wilds, looking for a way to piece together your shattered reality. Strangers will look on in sorrow, asking, who was that person? And they will say that was the person that learned what the 5th reason to play Baldur's Gate 3 if you're a Dungeon Master is. And they will say, thank goodness I do not have that knowledge. There but for the grace of God go I. And you will look on, hearing their whispered conversation, and pine for the blissful ignorance you once had. Reason number 1. Raw mechanics. Look, a lot of the time the rules in D&D end up being a bit fluid, causing a bit of variety between Dungeon Masters on how the game plays. Granted, you could hardly say that Baldur's Gate 3 is a one-to-one translation of current D&D rules, but it's also the closest thing we've seen in a video game. Previous versions of D&D video games have more in common with Diablo than they do with tabletop D&D. My point is that Baldur's Gate 3 is not fudging rolls, it's not skirting complicated mechanics to keep things running smoothly. The mechanics are presented in a raw and unavoidable scenario. There is a lot that you can learn from this as far as how to implement or ignore various game mechanics. However, it's worth noting, the game doesn't use ammo or traditional rationing and survival rules. Very interesting. Take from that what you will. Anyways, there is something eye-opening about playing certain scenarios with raw game mechanics. It allows you to put yourself in the shoes of your players and see what mechanics feel fun and interesting and what mechanics feel tedious and boring. There is a lot you can learn about peeking under the cover of various scenarios while you play through Baldur's Gate 3. Peek behind the curtain, see what the roll values are, what scores you're trying to hit for specific tasks, and just generally paying close attention to what the game is doing with the mechanics of Dungeons & Dragons that you are familiar with within each of the scenarios that it presents you can really give you a lot of valuable information in how you build your campaigns and your encounters in the future. Reason number 2. Player experience. If you are a forever Dungeon Master like myself, you probably don't get a lot of opportunities to play as a player character. And referring back to reason 1, these are good experiences to have. The ability to step into raw mechanic scenarios like infiltrating an enemy camp or trying to figure out a newly discovered trap put you in the mindset of the players, and more importantly, gives you first-hand experience of how it feels to succeed and fail in these scenarios. For example, there is a period very early on in the game, mild spoilers for, I guess, the early release of Baldur's Gate 3. There's a period very early on in the game where you go into a temple. And the first room that you enter in that temple has an elaborate trap placed into it if you open a certain sarcophagus. That trap is lethal for level 2 characters, which is what you are all in all likelihood to be, if not level 1 at that point. That said, the rewards for the trap aren't really that great unless you go a little bit further down into it. If there's but one survivor of the trap and no way to resurrect everybody, then eventually that survivor uncovers a method to resurrect party members at some cost. Now, as a video game mechanic, kinda neat, kinda cool, because if I blow everybody up, I can go to the previous save and try again. As a table, maybe that's rough. Maybe that trap's a little bit too strong, a little bit too explodey for annihilating an entire party. So, again, a lot you could learn. The trap is interesting, it's exciting, there's a lot to uncover, it adds a definite sense of danger, but Maybe in a tabletop version of that, I wouldn't annihilate a party. It sounds like it's a negative comment, but there's a lot to learn from the way it's constructed and the way it's presented. At the end of the day, more experience is the one thing that's always guaranteed to make you a better dungeon master. And it's even more valuable if you can add more experience as a player to that mix. Reason number 3, the plot. Look, if I may put my critic hat on for the moment, the narrative in Baldur's Gate 3 is not exactly groundbreaking. Most of the big twists are pretty telegraphed. Take that with a grain of salt, of course, as the game is still currently in early access. And look, for all I know, the game is destined to become a narrative masterpiece. I find that unlikely, but it's not my point. The amount of narrative in Baldur's Gate 3 is massive. Even with the limited content currently available, I was still finding new scraps of story on the 4th and 5th playthrough. And every good dungeon master steals and cobbles together his stories from existing influences. Is inspired by, if we want to rose-color things. But there is a lot here to stoke the fires of creativity for tons of future homebrew campaigns, or just stories you want to make up on the fly for one-shots. Honestly, if you can play through this thing without getting any new campaign ideas, you are probably not paying attention. Reason number 4, class experience. I already made one video about this in the past, so I'll try not to retread too much ground, but there's a lot you can learn from playing as different classes and subclasses in this game, because you may discover underused or misunderstood mechanics and details. As I illustrated in my Wild Magic Sorcerers video, it's interesting to see the game's interpretation of player classes from an official source to see how it compares to our own interpretations. Again, it's also a great opportunity to try out interesting class mechanics in a sandbox setting, where you can approach the game's same scenario in a variety of angles. I don't know what your personal Dungeons & Dragons group is like. I feel like for the vast majority of people, it's not often that you'll get an opportunity to replay the exact same scenario over and over again in a variety of classes and subclasses. I don't think anybody's D&D group is that good and consistent, but that being said, it does create an opportunity to learn a lot of new things and a lot of different approaches, and just being, again, in the shoes of the player, wearing those different hats under those different classes and subclasses, and seeing what options they have available to them. And moreover, as a dungeon master, what options feel fun to use and exciting. And when you play through as a certain subclass and a scenario comes out that seems perfectly tailored to your skill set, it feels awesome. And that will inspire you as a dungeon master to put those moments into your campaigns of the future because you know what they look like. For example, there was a period early on in one of my playthroughs as a barbarian where a Mind Flayer was fighting a Cambion. Now, the Mind Flayer told me to activate a control console, so naturally I walked up, grabbed the Mind Flayer by the ankle, and slapped the Cambion with it. It was the coolest shit in the world, and I got an inspiration point, I think. No, I didn't. Alright, but that's what I mean. Just tons of stuff, improvised weapons, weird scenarios, unusual uses of mechanics. And yeah, it's an easy way to get inspired to add more class-specific solutions to your campaigns in the future. Reason number 5, game mechanics. Again, I hardly think the story in Baldur's Gate 3 is going to set the world on fire. I don't mean that it's bad, calm down. All that aside, the game does some great things with establishing game mechanics as narrative devices. Let me give you an example. So paladins have oaths, right? And when a paladin breaks their oath, they lose their oath powers. But how exactly does that work? Is it something you've given any thought to? What does it look like when a paladin breaks his oath? What does it feel like? How does he get his oath back? The game answers these questions with a mysterious NPC who arrives in your camp to lay down the law for your oath-broken paladin, telling him for a fee that he can restore his oath, or he can choose the path of the Oathbreaker. Now, this is obviously a game mechanic. Paladins have oaths, they can break them, they need a game mechanic to recover them or start an Oathbreaker. But rather than making this a bland menu or a simple stat decision, The game has made it a character, a person with a backstory and everything that represents a new path, but also serves as a cautionary tale of what can be lost with this new path. The same is done with the ability to resurrect party members. We talked about this a little bit earlier. Minor spoilers ahead, but you meet an NPC who is an immortal undead who serves no other purpose other than to hang around your camp and resurrect your dead party members. But he's still a character. You can talk to him and ask him about his history, and he reacts to you. This is a great lesson of how to run your own games, using every part of the game mechanics as narrative, not allowing things to just happen because it's a game and the game things need to happen, but instead characterizing events and giving them weight and tangibility by doing so. So those are my top 5 reasons to play Baldur's Gate 3. It's a good game. It's not perfect. The game has a few glitchy issues here and there, and the dialogue options have "I totally didn't mean to say that way" problems. You know, where you're like, "Oh, I don't think that's a good idea," and your character flies off the handle. "Listen here, asshole!" You know, choosing something innocuous and your character flips over a table and shoots a dog. But my criticisms aside, I think the game is important to experience as Dungeon Masters for the primary reason that this is the closest approximation to playing D&D in a sterile, rules-only, repeatable sandbox environment that you will ever get. And by playing in that sandbox and experiencing all it has to offer while paying attention to all of its moving parts, what makes it work and not work in various places, you can learn a lot about crafting your own adventures in the future. I firmly believe there's a lot you can learn from games. I often say sometimes part of being a good dungeon master is good game design. So pay attention to your games and be ready to learn a few things that they have to teach you. And until next time, Puck out.